Now, you can probably tell by the verse it's up that I'm going to, as I share about my testimony, I'm talking about faith. And it's very important that before I share this story, I want you to understand clearly that I don't have all the answers. I don't have it all figured out. As I talk about faith, you need to know that I understand very clearly what it feels like to have faith, my faith stretched razor thin. And if I'm being very honest, I understand what it feels like to have my faith break and to have to rely on the faith of those closest to me to see me through it. But that'll make more sense here in just a minute. You see the verse before you, which is clearly a paraphrase, but I think it beautifully sums up the thought and intent of this particular verse. It says, we often suffer, but we're never crushed. Even when we don't know what to do, we never give up. Have you ever had a time in your life when you were ready to throw up your hands and quit? Well, hopefully in those moments, as people of faith, we don't give up. Because we understand that we serve a God who's so much bigger than any difficulty or trouble or trial that we might face. Go ahead and show that next one if you would, Joseph. I don't know if you know who Derek Redmond is, but he was a British runner in the 1992 Olympics. And this guy was so fast, so good, that everybody knew he was going to win a medal. It was just a question of which one. But as we know, life doesn't always turn out as planned. You see, in the next to the last race, as he was coming out of turn 2, just like that, everything changed. He popped a hamstring. Yeah, he was laying on the track, tears just pouring down his face. Everybody else finished the race. The cameras eventually focused back on Derek, who was laying there, and somehow he managed to get up, and he started doing this little hobble running step, kind of like this. He did it all the way down the back stretch, and when he got into the final stretch, his dad came running out of the stands. And all the Olympic officials said, man, you can't do that. And his dad said, watch me. And he put his arms around his son. And that's what they looked like when they crossed the finish line. And it was absolutely spectacular. And when they crossed the finish line, man, the crowd erupted in cheers. I was so excited. I was by myself in the living room watching this. I was jumping up and down on the couch, just excited to death because it was absolutely spectacular. Now remember, he didn't win anything. He didn't even qualify for the next race. His dream was over. It was dead. Think of the thousands and thousands and thousands of hours spent training for that moment. For nothing. Think of all the money that must have been spent. Tens of thousands upon tens of thousands of dollars. Training and traveling to prepare for that moment. And it was for nothing. But you see, he was determined to finish the race that he'd started. And because he did so, he inspired millions upon millions of people. Me being one of them. That's why I've titled my story. Go ahead and show the next one, please, Joseph. Keep the faith. So what are we supposed to do when life gets hard? Well, according to Hebrews chapter 12, we should keep our eyes focused on Jesus, the pioneer, the perfecter, the initiator of our faith. And people say to me, Jesus couldn't possibly understand what I'm going through. And I say, oh, really? Because if you read through the latter part of the book of Matthew, there's this amazing passage where Jesus is about to go into the garden to pray. And Jesus himself says, my soul is exceedingly sorrowful. One translation renders that my soul is crushed with grief, even to the point of death. Man, Jesus is hurting. And the question becomes why? And I think it's because Jesus fully understood what was about to take place. I think he understood what it was going to feel like for his best friends just to run away. I think he understood what it was going to feel like to be betrayed. I think he understood what it was going to feel like to have nails driven through his hands and feet and be put on a cross. I think Jesus fully understood what it was going to feel like to carry the weight of the sins of the world on his shoulders. And in his humanness, it wasn't something that he was like, all right, I get to go do this today. I mean, Jesus himself prayed, Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. It's almost like he's saying, man, you're asking too much. It's going to hurt too much. It's going to cost too much. But here's the thing. Still, Jesus was faithful. Because if you remember, his prayer continues to go on to say, nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. In other words, it doesn't matter how much it's going to cost. All that matters is that I'm faithful to your plan. Can you imagine what it would feel like to have the power to change the outcome of a situation and to choose not to use it to be faithful to God's plan? Y'all, it's a good thing I'm not God, I'm telling you right now. Because there's all kinds of people walking this earth, I could just flick right off. Boink, boink, boink. Please don't judge me. But that's the example that Jesus set for us. People say, okay, fine, I'll give you Jesus. Who else can we learn from? Well, in Hebrews 11, there's amazing stories of people of faith like Noah. Taught us about patience. That guy spent over 100 years building a boat with no rain in sight. What was life like for that guy? Somebody had to come up to him at some point and go, dude, like 60 years you've been working on this thing? It hasn't rained. It's not going to rain. It couldn't have been God that told you to do this. You've been out in the heat way too long. It's time to let it go. But still Noah was faithful, and he was patient. And he understood that God does things in his time, not in our time. Have you ever had a time in your life when it felt like it was taking God forever? Well, in those moments, maybe you could hear Noah kind of whisper in your ear, look, whatever you do, don't give up. Keep the faith. It may feel like it's taken forever, but God will always do what he promised he would do. And then we can learn from somebody like Abraham, who taught us about trust. If you remember, God gave Abraham a promise that he was going to be the father of a great generation, as many as the stars in the sky. And he and Sarah, who were already advanced in age, finally had Isaac. That was the beginning of the promise fulfilled. Yay. But then, as God often does, he throws a curveball. And he says, oh, hey, by the way, Abraham, I need you to sacrifice your son to me. So what must have gone through Abraham's mind? God, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, you gave me this promise, father of a great generation. We're not getting any younger. We finally see the promise being fulfilled, and now you want me just to throw that all away? I don't understand. But still, Abraham was faithful. Remember, he gathered up all the stuff. He goes up the hill, builds the altar, puts his son on the altar, goes to commit the sacrifice, and only then does God intervene. Has God ever called you to do something that just doesn't make any sense? Well, in those moments, maybe you could hear Abraham whisper in your ear, look, whatever you do, don't give up. Keep the faith. It may not make sense right now, but in time you'll understand because God knows what he's doing. And then finally, we can learn from somebody like Joseph. If there is anybody who understood a hard life, it was that guy. Remember, he had all these brothers. Most of them didn't like him. They wanted to kill him. The one brother that did like him said, no, let's not do that. Let's just throw him in the pit. So they threw him in the big hole. Then they see slave traders going by, and they sold their own brother as a slave. He endured all kinds of difficulty and hardship and brokenness, abandonment, loss, rejection, false accusation. I mean, I could go on, but still, Joseph was faithful. And as we know, God eventually turned the story around. Have you ever had a time in your life when it just felt like everything was falling apart? Well, in those moments, maybe you could hear Joseph whisper in your ear, look, whatever you do, don't give up. Keep the faith. See, anybody can serve God when everything's going great. But if you really want to see the test of someone's character, how do they serve God when everything's falling apart? And you might say, that's a swell little story, David K., but what do you know about life falling apart? Well, thanks for asking. In February of 2016, my wife came down with a rare infection, ESBL positive E. coli. We don't know how she got it. She'd been very, very sick. She'd been in the hospital for several days. We had tried every antibiotic they would allow us to try. Nothing was working. We were literally preparing for her to die. On the 6th day, we were desperate, so they approved for us to try a really strong antibiotic, but it had high risk of severe side effects. But again, we were desperate, so we did it. She did 10 days of bags of IV antibiotics about this big that went through a PICC line directly into her heart. Thank God it did kill the infection, but the side effect was it absolutely just destroyed her immune system. So when we got home from the hospital, she was very, very sick, just weak as water. We'd only been home from the hospital about 36 hours, and I got a call that my dad, who lived several hours away, had a massive heart attack. And I said, God, you got to be kidding me. I didn't know if my dad was going to live or die. My wife was still so very, very sick. I really wrestled with what to do, finally made the decision to go see my dad. He did survive, but he lost about 30% of his heart. I spent a couple hours with him, and then I came back home to take care of my wife. Now, I'd only been home about 36 hours from visiting my dad when I started feeling just the tiniest bit of pressure in my chest. And I mentioned it to my wife. And she said, you have to go to the hospital. You have history now because of your dad. And I was such a typical guy, y'all. I was like, oh, I do not. It's all in my head. It's just sympathy pain. I'm going to rub a little dirt on it. It'll be all right. She said, you've got to go to the hospital. I was like, I'm not doing it. She said, you've got to go to the hospital. I was like, I'm not going. She said, I'll make you your favorite food. I said, I am not. Okay. So my wife's cooking got me to the hospital. Now, when I saw the doctor's face, I could tell he didn't have good news. It turns out that the LAD artery in my heart, which they call the widowmaker, for obvious reasons, was 98% blocked. The other major artery in my heart was like 97% blocked. And the doctor said, you should have been dead months ago. So they rushed me into surgery, put a couple of stents in there to open those up, and then they put you on a bunch of blood thinner so you don't get blood clots around those new stents. And you might think, man, that's a lot to deal with in 10 days. Your wife almost dies, your dad almost dies, you almost died. Yeah, that was an awful, awful time. But I wish the story ended there. Just a few weeks later, my 16-year-old daughter at the time comes up to me and says, "Dad, my chest hurts." All of a sudden, the young lady who was an athlete could not walk across this room without getting dizzy and falling over. Her heart rhythm was just all out of whack. Her heart rate was just up and down all over the place. She was having severe chest pain all the time. We were literally living in fear that at any minute our daughter was going to have a heart attack and die right in front of us. She had to withdraw from school and from sports, and we just saw the emotional toll that took on her. It took over a year of going to doctors, and she ended up having heart surgery. And you might say that's a lot to deal with in a couple of months. Your wife almost dies, your dad almost dies, you almost die, and now you're living in fear that your daughter is going to have a heart attack and die. If I had to pick one word to summarize that time in life, it was just unbearable. That's what it felt like. I wish that were the end of the story. See, just a few weeks later, I was speaking in Benton, Virginia, and due to complications from the blood thinners and some other factors, I started hemorrhaging, bleeding in my brain. They took me to the hospital. I spent over 2 weeks in ICU. 2 weeks in the hospital, about 7 or 8 days in ICU, the most excruciating pain I've ever felt in my life. I didn't eat or drink for like 6 days. I was so dehydrated that when they were trying to put in an IV, they had to use an ultrasound, and it still took them like 5 or 6 hours because all my veins were just collapsed. I remember a team of doctors standing there in ICU and talking to my wife and I, and they said, "Here's the situation, and we're going to be very, very blunt. If we don't take you off the blood thinner, you're going to continue to bleed in your brain and you're going to die. That is a certainty." They said, "Or we can take you off the blood thinner. We'll pump your body full of platelets. We hope the bleeding in your brain stops. But you need to understand something very clearly. If we do that, because the stents in your heart are so new, there's about a 95% chance that you're going to get a whole bunch of blood clots in your heart and you're going to die." They gave me a 5% chance to live, much less ever play the flute again. So when I tell you I understand what it feels like to have life turn to quicksand, man, I understand what it feels like. And there are so many other things that continue to pile on, really even for several years after that I just don't have the time to deal with. But I'm going to be very transparent with you right now. And this is still very difficult for me to share, but I think it's important that you understand where I was. You see, when things happen like that in life, one after the other, after the other, after the other, and just piles on and piles on and piles on, it can chip away at your fight. It can chip away at your resolve. It can even chip away at your faith. And about day 5 or 6 in ICU, and I remember everybody I loved that almost died. I hadn't eaten anything in days. I was in more pain than I can possibly put into words. Life was in complete chaos. Man, I remember crying out to God and going, "God, I just can't do this anymore. I'm tired. Please, oh please, oh please, just release me from this cursed life." And then I thought of my wife and kids, who, y'all, I love more than anybody. But I am very ashamed to say that at that moment, even they weren't enough for me. And my prayer became, "But God, please make sure and send somebody to take care of my family. But just please make sure he's not too good looking." That was my exact prayer, man. That was a very, very dark time for me and my family. And it took a lot of distance and reflection to come to understand that those moments, man, those are the keep the faith moments. I like to call them furnace moments. You remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Right? The king builds the idol, and the music plays. They're supposed to bow down and worship. And they say, "No way, we've got one God and one God alone." So they're about to be thrown into the furnace that's been heated up really hot. And before they get thrown in, they boldly proclaim, "Our God is able to deliver us." And as Christians, we'll go, "Yeah, that's right." But why is it that so often we forget their very next sentence? Do you remember what it was? But if not, even if God chooses not to deliver us, we're still not going to bow down to your idol. See, that's keeping the faith, man. When you have no answers, you hang on for dear life. When you see no light at the end of the tunnel, you cling to your faith on those days or weeks or months when it feels like your prayers aren't going higher than your eyebrows. Man, you cling to your faith even if it's by your fingernails, even if the whole time you're begging God, "Please, oh please, oh please, don't make a fool out of me." Look, I'm not telling you this to discourage you or have you feel sorry for me. I'm actually trying to encourage you because, look, I have been to the darkest of the dark moments, and I can still say with conviction and with clarity that God is good. And God is and always will be faithful. So, man, whatever you're going through, whatever you're dealing with, whatever obstacle you look down the road and you think to yourself, "Man, there's absolutely no way." Whatever you do, just don't give up. Keep the faith. because God will always, always, always be faithful. I have told my kids since the day they could walk and breathe that there's going to come a day when you got to decide, do you or do you not want to be a man of God? Do you or do you not want to be a woman of God? And that starts with a simple choice. You have to resolve it within yourself. I would tell them it doesn't matter. So you can go, I don't care where I have to go, what I have to do, what I have to give up, what I have to be without. I want to be a man of God. I want to be a woman of God. And it starts with a choice. And faith is the exact same way. Eventually, we have to come to a place where we trust God beyond what we see, what we know, what we understand. And maybe that's just a tiny little baby step because that's all you got. Cool. As your faith grows, you take a bigger step. As your faith grows, you take a bigger step. But every single one of those steps starts with a choice. That's why I wanted to play this next hymn. It's my favorite of all time. It says, I'd rather have Jesus. I'd rather have Jesus than silver or gold. I'd rather have Jesus than wealth or fame. I'd rather have Jesus than any kingdom, than any applause. I'd rather have Jesus than anything this world has to offer. Man, is that the cry of your heart here this afternoon?